governments have borrowed for essentially three functions: to meet emergencies such as wars or disasters such as pandemics, to fund social infrastructure, think railways and roads and ports and public utilities, and finally also to fund social programs and transfer payments. Most people will agree that these are at the core of the functions that we expect governments to discharge. So in a sense, the book shows how public debt is instinctively connected with the political legitimacy of governments in history and today. Moreover, we also show how public debt securities are the foundation of developed financial markets, which also have historically been associated with the broader process of economic growth and development. I'm Rui Esteves, and I'm here to talk about my most recent book, co-authored with Barry Eichengreen, Asmaa, El-Ganainy, and Kris Mitchener, and the title is In Defense of Public Debt. COVID-19 was nothing if not a very big emergency, with extreme costs, economic, financial, but especially humanitarian. The recent death toll, officially recognized, goes over 5.3 million, and it's probably even much higher if you count it by excess deaths. For instance, the magazine The Economist just put the total death toll of the pandemic at between 7 and 13 million worldwide. So in a sense, governments had to ramp up public spending and consequently debt in these extreme circumstances to steady up their economies, to stabilize financial markets, and above all, to stop the spread of deadly disease. Keeping firms alive, keeping furloughed workers in payroll, feeding children, all of those are very costly and required very quick increases in public debt. Of course, critics have aimed at the design of these specific disaster programs and warned about the long-term financial consequences of this very large increase in spending. But, in general terms, no government who refused to spend under these circumstances would retain its political legitimacy. No government that wouldn't do what would be necessary to keep its economy alive and to contain the human and economic costs of the pandemic would not be discharging its functions. So we wrote the book because we were unsatisfied with the way public debt is most often than not described. So public debt usually gets bad publicity. Many authors before us have quite rightly questioned, how is it possible that ever-increasing debt burdens will be sustainable? And many of them have focused on those occasions when when governments are not able to live down their mountains of debt, and we call those defaults. All of that is good and fine, but we think that this is only a partial view and possibly a misguided one, because as I mentioned previously, public debt has been used to discharge very important political functions by governments in history and today. And in general, we also show that historically many nations actually have been able to deal with problems of debt sustainability without provoking the frequently large economic, financial, and political dislocations associated with a sovereign default. How did they do it? Well, we showed that it was a combination where governments turned to fiscal restraint when the time was right, but not before, clearly not during a crisis when the value of public debt is more important, by helping their economies to grow, and even possibly by keeping modest levels of inflation. And I guess the greatest and perhaps more interesting message of the book is that you need to deal with debt sustainability in the long term with all of these three elements, and doing so without all of them is probably a recipe for disaster. And this is a message that is directly applicable to the world we're in right now, with this discrete jump in the levels of public debt after the COVID pandemic to try and limit its economic, financial, and human costs.